Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Howard Brownstein, moderator for today's Compensation Committee webinar on compensation's role in a successful M&A. My background as a CEO and as a director is in turnaround management and guiding companies in transition. A merger or acquisition is often a huge transition that can bring upheaval to the day-to-day operations of two companies, yet the ultimate outcome is expected to deliver considerable value. Today, we're going to talk about the role that executive compensation can play in this scenario and how it can be a tool to help guide and drive the leadership teams into, through, and then ultimately out of a successful M&A. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dan Wetzel and Margaret Black from Pearl Meyer's Los Angeles office. Dan and Margaret both have a wealth of experience in the compensation issues related to an M&A. They are going to present some very useful strategic ideas on how you can leverage compensation to identify and reward leaders and align performance goals for the new company. And we will also look at some very critical issues to be aware of and related to change in control and contractual provisions. As I mentioned, we're going to focus today on the various ways a compensation committee can contribute to a successful merger or acquisition. And Dan is going to get us started. Dan?
Thanks, Howard. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss today's topic with board members, shareholders, and executives. As we know, we're continuing to operate in an environment of heightened level of M&A activity. Depending on the data source that you might see, as many as 50% or more of M&As fail to unlock the potential of the deal. In terms of reasons, the failure to fully appreciate the people and culture elements are frequently cited. M&As force directors, management to utilize skill sets outside the normal course of business, and the level of board involvement is unique to the skill sets the board brings to a particular transaction based on that transaction type. Regardless of the impact of the deal on the organization, aligning compensation to business and leadership strategies lies with the board and offers the opportunity to drive value creation and achieve critical objectives. Today, we're going to discuss several key areas to consider when going through a transaction and how the compensation committee and the board can increase the odds of success. To start off with, we're going to ask a polling question. How many of your boards have you experienced a potential or real transaction in the past 2 years? And this would be as a potential buyer, a potential seller, or both as a buyer and a seller. I think we'll give you everybody about 30 seconds here.
Should give us a good idea of our audience here.
So the approach that, to an M&A is really dependent on which side of the fence you're sitting on, right? As a buyer or as a seller. And there's both tactical and strategic objectives to accomplish on both sides. So we'll see where everybody's at here. Right. So we have a vast majority of you have experienced an opportunity with M&A on either the potential buyer side or both as a potential buyer and seller. It looks like the majority, in fact, vast majority. Can we move to the next slide? That's great information. So while there's any number of issues to be discussed regarding a potential transaction, given that this is the NACD's Compensation Series webcast, we've outlined 5 key buckets or areas of consideration for compensation issues and more broadly human resources issues which apply to both sides of the transaction. We recognize this is only a framework to work with. Each transaction, whether it's a merger of equals, an acquisition primarily of physical assets, a strategic tuck-in to the current business, or an acquisition which creates the company's offerings, increases the company's offerings, will all impact the level of criticality for any of the given issues above. However, as a starting point, we've outlined the following 5 areas for particular attention at the committee and board level. They include retaining and selecting talent, adjusting outstanding compensation arrangements, effectively establishing new compensation arrangements, communicating, and overcoming inertia. A little later in the discussion, we're going to talk about our uninvited guest to the party, Internal Revenue Code Section 280G and 4999, otherwise referred to as the Golden Parachute Rules. So why don't we move to the next slide here. For each of the 5 areas of discussion, we've bifurcated the issue to consider based on whether you're overseeing a sale or a purchase of the organization. On each of the following slides, the seller considerations are on the left-hand side and the buyer considerations are on the right-hand side of the page.
Dan, on the sell side, there are typically 3 critical concerns: maintaining the existing business and shareholder value, retaining key personnel through closing or shortly following close. But all the while, the board has to be considering what if the transaction falls through. Boards need to make sure that the individuals that are critical to both the ongoing business and for getting the transaction closed are retained and motivated. That's why at the outset of the transaction, boards and compensation committees should be reviewing all the compensation, the compensation programs, the equity plans, severance, incentive plans, and understand the implications the transaction is going to have on those programs. Are there any unexpected windfalls or losses? They also need to begin to categorize employees based on their importance to deal completion and to the ongoing business sale. As we are going to cover later, a significant consideration could be the impact of 280G on all the potential payments to the senior executives within the organization.
For the acquirer, there's added conditions to a successful transaction. In addition to reviewing all of the seller components, we also have to get an understanding of who's going to lead the due diligence process to create the right conditions necessary for a successful transaction, what roles are going to change as a result of the transaction, how well aligned are the cultures of the 2 organizations, and how do the current plans at the seller fit with retention of key personnel beyond the transaction. Right. Do the compensation plans of the buyer, that the buyer, not the seller, but the buyer has in place, propel the successful integration and maximize value going forward? And further, are there unintended or counterproductive consequences of the buyer's current plans which need to be adjusted and would otherwise impede success? For both, extensive due diligence by management will facilitate decision-making at the compensation committee and the board when it comes time to make adjustments.
Next slide, please.
So, second area is really adjustments to the outstanding compensation arrangements. And once these implications of the transaction have been thoroughly reviewed, right, we're really able to drill down as to whether those adjustments need to be made.
On the seller side, the seller is going to have a dual focus. First, if the transaction occurs, are there any compensation plans that require adjustment? I mean, even with the most carefully drafted documents, we commonly see that there is a lack of clarity due to the certain specific facts related to that incident. So for example, the transaction type could be impacting the actual payouts. This all requires a lot of attention and decision-making. For example, there are often questions about how the transaction will affect performance goals, which are going to be interrupted midstream. Do the plans pay out as one might expect given the timing of the transaction? There could be a lack of clarity on how payments are treated if the golden parachute rules apply. Can payments be reduced? What payments are going to be reduced if so? Then there's always the second track that has to be followed if a transaction does not occur. So this doesn't typically require significant adjustment by the committee, but they will still want to continue to go through the ongoing process to be able to quickly respond if the transaction doesn't succeed or falters.
I mean, frequently the timing of the deal, right, extends beyond the normal equity grant cycle or the bonus cycle. So compensation committees have to be prepared to immediately resurrect those plans, which might be at a standstill based on the transaction agreement, if the deal doesn't go through. On the buyer side, in addition to the modification issues at the seller, the board is likewise required to review the buyer's compensation arrangements and make adjustments as necessary. Frequent areas of adjustment include annual and long-term incentive performance awards, right? Do the plans provide for unintended consequences, positive or negative, which can be adjusted within the parameters of the plan? Are there provisions in the employment or change of control agreements which might trigger on the deal? That's infrequent, but it does and sometimes does occur. And do the plans have sufficient discretion that the committee can take action to provide for the right level of pay for performance that's expected here? So let's go to our second question, which is a polling question, which is, when was the last time your company added or made changes to the exec comp program in terms of annual incentive performance metrics, the long-term incentive performance metrics, change of control agreements, or severance agreements? And we've outlined this as, we do this annually. It occurs this year, last year, the year before, more than 3 years ago, or we haven't done it.
And just to be clear, Dan, that question relates to ongoing business changes, not necessarily in the context of a transaction.
Right. So, Howard, have you, what is your experience with going through the due diligence process and then, adjusting arrangements and the need to make adjusted arrangements, either on the seller or the buyer side?
Thanks, Dan. This is absolutely critical. No matter what a company's balance sheet looks like, a lot of the real assets go home every night. And you've really got to be proactive because M&A activity is inherently destabilizing for an organization. It involves risk for both sides. And so people start worrying about their careers. If they've been thinking of leaving, they figure, well, maybe now might be the time. There's a lot of rumors circulating. And so really the board needs to make sure that it and management are way out in front of this and are dealing with potential issues before they come up. So being proactive is absolutely critical.
And, even going to the sort of the tactical side of this, for example, thinking about it, you might on the buyer side have an incentive program or you might have goals and strategic objectives that are higher growth goals than what you might be, able to achieve or think you're able to achieve on an organic basis. And so the incentive plans might say basically, well, we're not going to exclude the benefit of a transaction on whatever the bonus payments are or the performance metrics. In those cases, the board and the comp committee have already pre-established that acquisitions are going to be a positive and don't make any you aren't going to be required to make changes. But in other organizations, you really have already excluded those, and you're going to have to make some adjustments for those plans going forward. So let's see the outcome of this results now. I think we've had enough time. So we've got over half of the companies that have reviewed or made changes on their metrics annually, as well as another, call it 30% within the past 2 years. That's great. So what we would expect, right? Companies are annually reviewing this. Often they're keeping the measures because they're comfortable with it, and then in other cases they're making incremental change. So the third area of consideration then is really the establishment of new compensation arrangements.
Right. For the seller, the next step is really considering implementation of new arrangements to maintain the talent within the organization. As Howard mentioned, people are getting worried and are going to be concerned about their careers. So this could be consideration of enhanced severance, retention plans, or perhaps transaction-related bonuses. In the early stages, the compensation committee is going to be able to approve those arrangements, but further along in the transaction, the company may be restricted by the transaction agreement and require some type of buyer approval on making those new awards and grants. Also, depending on the transaction, the seller may want to continue with the ordinary course compensation adjustments reviews, continue along the compensation committee calendar to plan just in case that deal is not consummated.
On the buyer side, in addition to all the issues that are going to be reviewed on the seller employees, an entirely new paradigm might be required for the compensation structure and organizational structure. Right, with the inclusion of the seller's business and integration issues critical to success, short and long-term plans may require that adjustment to drive success. For example, if synergies have been committed to Wall Street, Should you consider having an incentive plan that incorporates a measure of synergy goals? For longer-term goals, in addition to expected synergies, right, are there different performance measures which better reflect the company's goals going forward? For example, does the target company have a higher margin business that will require revisiting the performance targets? Is there going to be a change in investment strategy due to the transaction? And does that require changes to an expected ROI on the incentive plans? Award levels might also need to be adjusted, or salary or bonus for that matter, as executives take on additional roles and responsibilities within the organization. Further, particularly for the executive compensation, where we typically have peer groups that help establish what sort of the magnitude of pay might look like, peer groups themselves might need to be adjusted depending on the impact of the size of the new entity. The buyer must also consider how to best onboard seller employees and their culture into the organization while retaining the buyer employees. So, questions that come up include sort of who should be participating in selected programs, how will the company operate with separate systems, is that going to be something that's going to be changed day one, or are we going to see this as a 3-year transition period? Are the measures of performance at the seller going to be continued, or are they going to change over? How autonomous is the seller business units going to operate? These are all key questions that need to be answered and addressed by the compensation committee and the board. And then, of course, we also have overlaying this, the uninvited guest 280G, which requires consistent attention because as we make adjustments, we have to be cognizant that those adjustments might, in fact, have negative consequences to this. So, Howard, how does that fit in with your, experience in terms of managing a acquisition, and by establishing new arrangements?
Thanks, Dan. Well, as we all know, every situation is different. No two are ever alike. But what you stated creates a terrific conceptual framework for making sure you're covering all the bases. Obviously, you want there to be a full discussion in the comp committee and in the board entirely to make sure that you've surfaced all the potential issues and you're out in front of them. But I think what you've given is a good framework.
Great. So let's go to the fourth area, which is communicating effectively. Obviously, the M&A process, as Howard mentioned, drives change in both organizations, fundamental change. And employees are going to be concerned about their future career development and their job security. And this runs the whole gamut, whether it's executive all the way through the organization.
Right. On the seller side, of course, the employees are going to want timely and clear communication about all of the impending changes and how those changes and the transaction is going to affect their future employment opportunities. No doubt everyone is going to be concerned about their careers, where things are going. In addition to the employee side communications, the company is going to need to prepare a press release announcing the transaction, the synergies of the deal, etc. And often shortly following that, for the merger proxy, they need to prepare additional disclosures informing all the shareholders about NEO transaction pay, any new arrangements or recent adjustments that were agreed to prior to closing with the NEOs is going to need to be disclosed. The board is going to be very instrumental in making sure all these external communications show that the company is going to be well prepared for either a go or no-go situation.
That's right. On the buyer side, in addition to the communication to the seller's employees, the comp committee of the board is going to oversee and in some cases approve communications for sort of a broad set of constituents, right? Whether it's the seller's employees, the buyer's employees, executives, shareholders, and the community at large. And this might relate to public disclosures. It might relate to role changes within the organization, executive departures, amendments to agreements, and fundamental changes to the compensation programs themselves. So constituents will want to understand what changes have been made and why they were necessary to drive the successful integration and future strategy of the business. The fifth and final area for consideration is overcoming uncertainty.
That will apply to both the buyer and seller alike?
Yes. So the compensation committees and boards for both buyer and seller should be open to comp plans which don't fit the paradigm of an ordinary course or best practice design as has been promulgated in the marketplace and by some of the institutional investor advisory groups. Each transaction really affords the company a unique opportunity to change the fortunes of the business, and the successful outcomes might rely on the efforts of a critical few or significant fundamental change throughout the organization. In all cases, the comp plans should help drive that required change to overcome resistance, gamesmanship, and inertia. And compensation committees and boards serve a crucial role in ensuring that changes remain grounded in supporting and reinforcing near and long-term business and leadership strategies of the combined entity. So now let's take another polling question here. So when was the last time that your company reviewed pro forma change of control potential payouts, including the impact of a 280G or impact of 280G? And in particular, what we're looking for is, not in the context of a deal per se, but just on an ongoing concern. And in particular, whether you're looking at the 280G implications as opposed to just the gross payments that would be made. And again, this is sort of the same format that we had before, annually, this year, last year, the prior year. So a good, potentially a good example of thinking about this ordinary course of business issue is when we think about synergy bonuses or cost savings, right, related to the combined entity, and or the incorporation of those synergy bonuses in a long-term plan. Typically shareholders look at the incentive plans and they want to see longer-term periods, 1 year for annual and 3 years for a long-term performance period. The difficulty with synergy goals and other goals like EPS is when you're going through a transaction, you don't know how fast. We've committed to a certain number of goals. We don't really know how fast that's going to be accomplished. So in some cases, a better plan design might be to say, we're looking at the annualized rate, but we're only looking at a particular quarter. And that may not fit the paradigm of, sort of typical practice within how we would normally think of incentive plans, but might be the best outcome for this organization. So let's see if where our answers came in here. So we have a quarter of the companies say that they review the 280G calculations annually,
really?
And then we've had another 23, looks like 30% over the last 2 years. Now, to some extent, it's a little bit of a surprise, I think, to me, although we did have 100% practically of companies go through a transaction in the last, or consider a transaction over the last 2 years.
Yes.
So as part of that process, I think our experience has been that because it's not required as a public disclosure to calculate what the 280G implication is, that we tend to not see as frequently a review absent a situation where companies are actually in a deal situation.
That's correct. Some companies are doing it annually, but we don't see a ton of them that haven't been through the actual M&A doing that. On the next slide, we are providing an overview of the types of activities that can be expected to show up on the seller's board's compensation committee calendar. As we keep emphasizing, the seller is going to be highly motivated to be making sure that that talent isn't walking out the door once the transaction is announced. That's why at the outset of a deal, the hint of a deal, it's common to see boards ensuring that they do have adequate severance programs in place, not just for the executive team, but for the broad-based employee population as well. Also, it's common to see the board consider implementing retention vehicles for some of the key talent. The board is going to want to understand all the potential costs of all of these change of control payouts, the severance, the retention, the change of control, bonuses, et cetera, and how those measure in comparison to the overall transaction value, just to make sure that it's in line with, it's a reasonable amount. During the deal negotiation phase, there begins to be a great deal of interest by the buyer to also know those numbers. They'll be pressing on the due diligence team to produce those. Somewhere during the due diligence phase, the company will be quantifying all those payouts and the 280G liabilities and apprise the board of those results. As we'll be discussing later, the golden parachute rules get a lot of attention in a transaction, take a lot of time up. That's because the rules are really penalizing the executives as they receive a 20% excise tax on anything that's excessive. Now, we're presuming as we're speaking here that most of you are pretty familiar with 280G, you know the basics, but if you're rusty on the rules, we've added the basic concepts in the appendix, so feel free to look back there and review the rules if you're a little rusty. Not only are the sellers quantifying all the potential change in control payouts for the buyer, but they're going to have to disclose all of the details about the change in control pay in the transaction filings. As we mentioned previously, recent actions, if there's been some deal negotiations or negotiations relating to restructuring, severance, et cetera, all those recent actions are going to need to be disclosed in the transaction filing.
And we shouldn't forget to mention that shareholders also have an opportunity to vote on, a separate non-binding, say, on golden parachute resolution at the same meeting at which approval is sought for the transaction itself. This is non-binding, similar to the regular annual say on pay for public companies for named executive officers. But it is something that puts additional pressure, I think, on boards ultimately when they're looking at making revisions on the seller side to their outstanding arrangements, because they prefer to have already have publicly provided that information in their annual say on pay. And going back to the golden parachute rules, if a change in control is anticipated to close, following the calendar year of the transaction announcement, and we have 280G problems, the board is almost certainly to be asked to consider year-end planning actions to help mitigate some of those 280G exposures. Accelerating income into the year prior to the change in control increases the base amounts and the safe harbors, and as a result of that, it will reduce excise tax exposures. So these types of actions, will likely be asked by the seller's board first or seller's compensation committee, but it may ultimately require approval by or at least cooperation with the buyer.
Next slide, please. But as we mentioned, the selling board is always continuing on that dual track, operating business as usual in case the deal does not close. So depending on the timing of the transaction, the board has to continue along the normal compensation committee calendar and complete the annual compensation reviews, determine achievement of the annual and long-term performance incentive goals, etc. If the transaction is set to close before the end of the fiscal year, handling of the performance awards, annual bonus, long-term performance awards, that's often negotiated when signing the transaction documents. We do often see that those awards are either prorated or the results are guaranteed at a certain level of results.
Well, and I guess the other, the change of control is almost undoubtedly going to occur mid-cycle for long-term incentive plans. And as a result of that, the performance awards, may have a prescription in their award agreements as to how those awards are going to be treated, and or it may be as part of the merger agreement. But if it's not clear, in any case or any particular situation, we tend to see that the boards are going to try and determine what is fair and reasonable in that particular circumstance.
Next slide, please. Boards are also going to need to decide whether to proceed in the normal course by setting new incentive goals, granting new equity awards, and continuing kind of with business as usual. If the deal is anticipated to close, the transaction documents we often see specify the types of normal course actions that would be allowed for setting compensation, such as new bonuses, granting new equity awards, etc.
So, Howard, how in your experience, how long have the deals tended to take before close, and how has that affected sort of this idea between CIC closes and a no-close ongoing compensation arrangements or agreements that need to be accomplished by the board or the comp committee?
Well, the rule of thumb is they always seem to take too long. You always go into the deal with a timetable that turns out to have been a little too ambitious. Now, that's not applicable, obviously, to distress situations, but we're not focusing on that today. And so it almost always takes longer, and you really have to manage expectations. I would say anywhere from several weeks to a few months is typical. There's quite a lot of time needed to vet all these things out. And that's why, again, it's so important for the comp committee to prepare well and begin with the end in mind. At the very least, they should have a very thorough understanding of their own comp arrangements. After all, they helped create them. And that way they'll be better able to see how do these relate to the counterpart company, how might we integrate them, what's needed. But it's a lot of work, and the comp committee ought to be pretty busy during M&A activity, and if they're not, then there's a lot of risk that isn't being recognized.
I would agree. So thanks, Howard. Let's turn to the buyer side now. So, likewise, as a board member of the buyer, there's any number of action steps that are going to be taken by management, but the board, in particular the compensation committee, are going to be managing a number of issues during the transaction. So we've outlined, a brief overview of this process. Now, sort of as Howard had mentioned here, each transaction is different, and it will require, varying degrees of understanding and actions by the boards and the comp committees. If we have a merger of equal, that has an entirely different implication than if we're making a small acquisition that represents 5% of the entire business. And while we put the overview here in place, it's not intended to be a drill-down comprehensive, right? Each issue within this has any number of subcategories to think about. But conceptually, I think you start with the concept of looking at the overall due diligence of this, focusing on quantification of the values that might be triggered in severance arrangements, in equity costs at the seller, and whether or not this is in fact going to sort of preclude a deal. What type of 280G exposures we have, how do we manage those 280G exposures, and then ultimately what's the compatibility of the programs? Do we have the same pay philosophy as an organization as the seller? Do we target pay at the same rate? Do we match our jobs similarly to how, for external purposes, that the seller does? Does the seller have a more focus on annual incentive or incentive at risk as compared to our organization? How does that play out in terms of whether the focus is on corporate results or business unit results or individual results? Do we provide equity on a similar basis, right? Are we providing equity at a managerial 1 level and above, or is it the philosophy of the seller that they have granted equity to everybody within the organization? This is particularly true for transactions that might not be related to two public entities. What we might have a private equity or a private company being acquired by a public entity, and we have all sorts of additional risk associated with that, where they might have a relatively few individuals that were compensated well on an equity basis, but then didn't drive it through the organization, whereas what we might have is something that is a much more broad-based equity program. And then there's, sort of the risk associated with losing that senior talent, but we're likely to also be able to attract and retain the sellers, the lower level employees within the sellers. So each one of those areas is going to be rather critical, and then we have to assess the culture itself, right? Is this a cowboy organization focused on individual stars as opposed to maybe, our organization, which is focused on communal results? The other thing then is looking at it from the standpoint of identifying the key individuals within the transition or integration team. That's going to be both operational folks and it's going to be folks for, as we think about it, for the HR component of this. And then setting objectives for that team so that we have some sense of what we might expect in terms of integration, or at least understanding when the integration would likely to occur within this organization, and what pitfalls we might have identified or, through this sort of fit analysis between the two companies. And then, not to be forgotten is a communications roadmap, which is critical to be, developing throughout this process and to be flexible based on the findings that we come up with. Next slide, Ronell, here. So the other areas then, as we've talked a little bit about, is the retention assessment. Having gone through that process, what type of additional components might we expect for both buyer and seller employees? At what level? There's always a situation where there's a significant concern that people might be terminated, and it may not be a real concern. But the reality is that that's still a concern on the, particularly on the seller side. And so we could do something that would enhance, an overall severance program, for example, that might be sunsetting in 2 years or 12 months after the transaction, that provides a comfort and really is not a cost driver because it's really just contingent pay, and since we never intended to have any changes at that particular business unit, they've sort of gotten protected, and it really didn't cost us anything. And then we have to talk about, and cover sort of targeting employment offers. Ultimately, for the senior executives, what type of agreements did they have? What type of post-closing employment agreements should we be developing for them? Who do we want to keep? And as we're making adjustments here, we have to be careful about 280G implications there.
So, Dan, the buyer is going to be plenty busy.
The buyer's very busy in these transactions, right? And then you have things like, if you're acquiring the business and their awards, the equity plan, usually you have a reserve. In other cases, we're making an acquisition where the company didn't have equity that's outstanding and available. So, we might have planned for going back to shareholders for a new reserve on our equity plan 3 years from now, and now we found out that we have to go back to shareholders this year or next year, right? So there's all these implications that have to be gone through on an ongoing basis. Let's do another polling question here. So when was the last time your company reviewed? Take that back. When the last time you reviewed your change of control agreements, were there provisions identified that were unclear? And sort of what was the impact associated with that? So we've identified here limited impact or no to the total values, that it could have a moderate impact, that it could have a significant impact, or we haven't reviewed it. So I had a situation many years ago now where they had a change of control provision that was put in place, and the way it was written in terms of the benefits, they had a benefit provision in there that someone would get, an enhanced provision under that. And unfortunately then, the way that the document had been written, it appeared that was actually a circular reference. So you just kept adding it in, and then as you had another payment that would come through, you would have to add that payment back in. And so it came out to be, well beyond what the intent of the original committee was in terms of potential value, and the company had to go through this process of figuring out what they were actually going to do with that. So Howard, have you either, sort of on an informal or formal basis kind of conceptualize this with companies that you have been a comp committee member or board member on in terms of thinking about it from either the buyer or the seller perspective? Putting this in buckets and then, having management basically provide, the key information here.
Sure, absolutely. And this ties in with one of the questions that one of our audience members has posed about where the buyer and seller have very different compensation plans. So assuming that I'm looking from the viewpoint not just of the buyer or the seller, but as a board member of the completed transaction, I'm going to be looking to think about how do I align compensation with the strategy of the combined company. And that may be different than the strategy of either the buyer or the seller, and it may be different than their compensation plans. And so you kind of look at it anew. Now, it's a tricky governance issue because I'm sitting there with a fiduciary duty of the to the shareholders of the buyer or the seller, and that's my job. But part of my job is to only engage in a transaction that will work unless it's a once and done deal and then, the seller walks away and is done forever, in which case I don't have to think about post-deal type of considerations. But usually I do. Usually I'm on the buyer side, and so I'm thinking about integration from day one. And we'll talk more about integration later.
Great. So let's take a look at the answers then to the poll here. So interestingly, we've got at least half the companies that there were unclear provisions, but it had a relatively minimal impact. And then we've had another group of companies that had a relatively moderate amount of impact on the transaction. This is kind of what you and I would find, right, when we're going through these?
Yep. There's usually always something that's a little unclear.
Right. Okay, so let's turn our attention then to kind of the impact on 280G in M&As. Ultimately, shareholders are not thrilled about recognizing the benefits of change of control provisions, but we shouldn't forget the positives. They are put in place to protect executives in the event of a transaction. They're put in place to protect the employees who are equity participants, right, based on the value that they've created for their shareholders prior to the transaction. And they certainly help both employees and executives remain focused and committed to, maximizing the value of the company, even though they may, in the executive case in particular, be facing the opportunity to lose their job after the transaction is finalized.
Yeah, but the benefits that they can receive upon the change of control or upon termination following the change of control can really be significantly eroded if 280G applies, because, as we mentioned previously, there's a 20% excise tax on anything that's considered excessive under the rules. This can make for very unhappy executives, can make board members feel as if they're not providing the intended benefits, and these types of matters are just not easily resolved at the 11th hour. So in the following slides, we're going to cover the top 7 issues, mistakes we see companies making when it comes to the change of control programs, quantification, and golden parachute matters.
So as we saw actually in our polling, we had quite a few companies that actually have been reviewing and quantifying the change of control provisions, but I would say that probably varies a lot by large organization versus small, and also by whether or not we're having constant inquiries as to a potential transaction. So the issue that we typically find is that the named executive officers we require to provide disclosure on that in terms of the gross payments, but there's no real requirement to quantify the impact of 280G. You basically just put in a little footnote that says, this doesn't include whatever impact the 280G would have. And so we really end up, deferring payouts until there is a change of control, and fixing the problems are really significantly harder to do on the eve of a deal when we're under a heightened level of scrutiny, ultimately to demonstrate, prudence of the decisions of the board. And there's also a second issue, which is that under the regs, there's a presumption that payments are going to be made or entered into within a year of a change of control are presumed to be made as a result of that change of control, and therefore they're treated more negatively than if you had previously made those. So quantifying this on a regular basis, I think, makes good sense for boards, and it helps identify these trouble spots in your plans. And because we're making changes to our arrangements every single year, you tend to create problems having fixed the prior ones.
Right. The next matter that we want to talk about that can be helpful is allocating value to the non-compete provisions. Payments that are demonstrated with clear and convincing evidence to be reasonable comp for post-change of control services are not considered parachute payments and are excluded from the 280G calculations. Under the regulations for 280G, refraining from performance of services can be considered services for purposes of applying post-change of control reasonable comp. Therefore, allocating value to the non-compete restrictions can really substantially reduce the 280G impact with the right set of facts. So let's go to the next slide. We've got a simple example of the power of applying post-change of control reasonable compensation in a 280G calculation. The beauty of arguing that a payment is post-change of control reasonable compensation is that it reduces the value of the payments that are included in the calculation and tested under the safe harbor. So in the above example, we had an executive that was entitled to a $4 million payment. His base amount is $1 million, so doing the math, his safe harbor is 3 times that less $1, so $2,999. And without applying his post-reasonable compensation, the executive will be paying not only the income taxes associated with the $4 million, but also he will be paying a $600,000 excise tax. However, if we can, on the right-hand side of the column, we apply an allocation to a non-compete of $2 million, then the executive now has change of control payments of $2 million, so $4 million minus the $2 million allocated is the $2 million, tested against the safe harbor. The executive is not over his golden parachute safe harbor, and therefore he's paying no excise taxes. So he's got a savings of $600,000 in excise tax. Similarly, the company is not going to lose the tax deduction on that excess parachute payment.
So, I mean, while these are tax, these are, tax issues in a sense. What we have is, specialists that are looking at this. It seems to me that, boards and comp committees typically do look at these transactions and whether or not you should be applying any one of these situations to a particular situation. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
And is it common to see the covenants, not to compete, are applied to change of control and severance agreements?
Well, it's common to see the companies looking to see if it can be applicable. To meet the clear and convincing test, there is typically the value assigned is the lesser of the value determined by an independent valuation expert or the compensation the executive would have earned post-closing. So if the executive is market-facing, typically the valuation expert will be able to come up with a good value for that non-compete. In the event the executive is not really market-facing, it may not be applicable. There may be no value to be assigned. Shall we move on to the next slide?
Yeah. So the third area is really post-change of control reasonable comp. And it doesn't really apply just to non-competes. It can be applied to other types of comp as well. So when executives are expected to work post-closing, we can apply to things such as the performance awards or retention awards or consulting agreements. There's a real value from the standpoint that, to the extent that we want to have individuals work with the organization, they can receive some potential benefit from that in addition to whatever we might be negotiating in the deal itself.
The next issue that we want to cover is the impact that performance awards have on the 280G results when awarding pay.
So this is important for boards to understand, not just in the sort of the deal setting, but also when you're establishing pay mixes. Performance awards are not included in performance awards are included in 280G calculation in their entirety.
Right, and that contrasts with time-based awards, pure service-based awards, where there's a special rule that significantly discounts the value of the payout. So when you're granting those performance-based awards, just recognize that if paid mid-cycle or guaranteed payout upon a change in control, these awards are going to be full parachute payments included in the 2AG calculation and counted against the safe harbor significantly.
So on the fifth issue...
Next slide, please.
Oh, thanks. We see this quite a bit in that it catches everybody off guard. But sometimes you will make guarantees of annual bonuses or the performance levels as part of the deal negotiations, or they might even be hardwired in the documents. And while we shouldn't, not consider guaranteeing annual bonuses, what happens is that we should be aware that those guarantees will mean that the awards are going to be treated as change control payments and included in the calculation.
In full.
In full. And that could have a significant impact on executives' payouts and levels.
Right. Now, to reduce the negative impact of all of that, they can consider either pre-change in control reasonable compensation or post, as we discussed before, depending on which is applicable. Now, we're going to run into 280G to the second power, which is assessing pre-change in control reasonable compensation. This is a helpful tool as well. It's not always as helpful as the post-change in control reasonable compensation, because in this case, if an award is treated as pre-change in control reasonable compensation, the amount has to be included when testing against the base amount. So we're going to go to a quick example to help you better understand that. So next slide, please. So in this example, we have, again, a payment of $4 million. We have assessed that the pre-change in control reasonable compensation on the amount is $2 million. We have the same base amount in safe harbor. So when we argue that something is reasonable comp, but it's for pre-change in control services, it gets included in the 280G calculation. It doesn't reduce the amount that we're testing against the base amount. So essentially what it is if you have reasonable comp in excess of the base amount, then you can get some benefit out of this. So in our left-hand column, we do not apply reasonable comp. The executive is paying excise taxes of $600,000 and also paying income taxes. But with the application of pre-reasonable compensation, since $2 million is above the $1 million amount, we can reduce the excise taxes by $200,000. So it's helpful. With the right set of facts, it can be very helpful.
So our last issue on 280G is doing it yourself calculations. And we do stumble on companies that have done this on occasion.
Right. We don't recommend it. We don't recommend it. The 280G calculation process is really complicated, extremely data-driven, very fact-specific. As we mentioned before, the agreements can be unclear. There are just so many gray areas, and attention to detail is key. Logic is not going to work. We're dealing with the tax code. So. And
we have a dollar materiality threshold.
Right, right.
So I think the key takeaways here is we understand that there's, the key to the successful merger and acquisition lies in the integration. Hopefully we've gotten some insights here for boards and comp committees to take as consideration. For sellers, retention and planning for a no-close situation are key. For buyers, extensive pre-planning is necessary. The boards are going to be very active in this, and then taking action on both seller and buyer programs. And for both, we have 280G implications that can impede and certainly need to be reviewed for purposes of determining what the best course of action is. As a director, the board's proactive approach to the role of compensation, in unlocking the value of the M&A can have a meaningful impact on the company's successful transaction. Howard, let's see if we kind of late on time, but let's see if we've got any questions here.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Dan Margaret, for a great presentation. We just have a little bit of time left, and so I wanted to preface taking questions by mentioning that for any questions we don't get to today, the Perlmutter team will follow up with the audience member who posed a question separately by email, so you will get your question addressed. So let's just mention one thing that came up, which is transaction bonuses. What do you see with regard to those, Dan and Margaret, and how are they treated?
So I think what happens in some cases, transaction bonuses themselves are fairly infrequent. In most of the public space and even with private equity, you already have a substantial amount of equity that is available to and would be payable upon a transaction or upon a transaction and subsequent termination of employment. And that generally acts as a good motivator. Where we do see transaction bonuses is more on a distressed company sale side, where you have already granted some level of equity and the options are out of the money and will be out of the money upon the deal, or if you're in a situation where the performance awards wouldn't necessarily vest. So we do see them under certain circumstances, but it's not as common, ultimately. And it's usually related to the seller as opposed to the buyers.
Dan and Margaret, when should the comp committee or the board be reaching out for someone like Perlmutter in this process?
Well, I guess I would think about this from three different perspectives. One is most companies probably have a comp consultant. The larger public companies would on an ongoing basis. They should be involving those individuals really early stage, because sometimes what happens is, as Margaret mentioned, you're negotiating a deal and you're all of a sudden guaranteeing bonuses on the buyer side, and that has 280G implications, and you've already negotiated, the deal gets announced, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So your ongoing comp advisor, you should be advised early on as much as possible on this, or that you're thinking about it. We all have confidentiality agreements in place, and so it is something that I think is worth doing. The second part is the 280G side, and that also should be done as soon as the deal is announced. We should be starting to work on 280G and bringing in some outside resources.
They're going to request that as well. The buyer will be requesting.
The buyer and the seller, right.
Will be requesting to see the calc, so yes.
And then the third is sort of on the due diligence side. You typically have you have an HR team, and in many cases they will be hiring a external HR specialist to really go through that due diligence process to understand what those compensation arrangements are.
Thank you. Well, listen, we just have a minute remaining, so on behalf of NACD, I want to thank our friends at Perlmutter, Dan Wetzel and Margaret Black, for a wonderful presentation.